That is one introduction. Thank you for that. Another one is, I do recognize some faces out there, but a lot of you, I've never seen you and you've never seen me. And so it is very common that when people would hear me speak for the first time, they have this thought in their head. They don't say it out loud because it sounds inappropriate, but they think, why would the organizers of the event allow a teenager to do one of the talks? So if you're thinking that, it's okay. You're welcome to think that. In fact, some of you might have heard this story, but several years ago, I'm preaching on a Sunday, and a lady sitting in the back row, about 80 years old, comes up after service, right down front, stands about a foot away, doesn't smile, just looks at me head to toe like she's appraising something from a garage sale. And then the only thing she says is she simply says, "Okay, you look a little bit older up close." So I just looked at her and said, "Well, so do you." No, I didn't say that. I wouldn't have a job if I said that. She just walked away. The first part of that story is true. But I'm thrilled to be here. I'm actually thrilled to be here from a learner's perspective. About 2 weeks ago, I sat in a room at my home church with several other ministers, and the topic of the meeting was, how do we do a better job elevating parents and families at Memorial Road? I'd give us a C+ as far as how we do that, and we want to get better at equipping families and empowering families and teaching families. And so I'm just thrilled more than anything to be a learner in this environment this weekend. So what I want to talk about just for a minute right now and later this afternoon is, how do you raise kids to be disciples? And this morning's talk is going to be more geared towards how do you do that in the culture we live in today, and then the afternoon is going to be what do you do at home with children. It's a really weird world to raise kids in today. We're pretty big on reading books out loud to our kids. So I've got a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, both girls, and my wife loves to read. She loves to read out loud, and she's always reading books. And usually we read fantasy to our kids, and on the way down here, she brought a book we were going to start, and I read this book as a kid, but I hadn't read it in 20, 25 years. And the book was Summer of the Monkeys. Anybody ever read Summer of the Monkeys? It's an old book. So it's set about 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, out in kind of farmland. And so we read the first few chapters, and I was reminded about how simple life was 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Not that it was easier, but it was very, very simple. There was no internet. There was no cars. You just had your family, and that was the primary way that you learned growing up. It is so different today. In fact, just a story about how crazy just culture is, or especially technology. A year ago, I'm preaching a sermon about the culture of luxury that we have in our country. Everything's easy. You can get it all the time. And I was making this point that just a few years ago, if you wanted to get something at the grocery store, you actually had to get in your car, drive to the grocery store, buy it, and come home. But nowadays, that's not the case. And so in this sermon, I said, nowadays, you can simply say, "Alexa, order toilet paper," and it'll show up on your doorstep a few days later. So I say that in first service. Bible class rolls around, and one of my members comes up to me and he says, "Phil, you owe me $60. I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, my wife's at home. She's watching the service via live stream. So your voice carries throughout my living room, and you said, 'Alexa, order toilet paper.' Well, my Alexa speaker was on, and she heard you, and she put $60 of toilet paper in my Amazon shopping cart. So, sir, you owe me $60. It's like, are you kidding me? Couldn't believe it. A few days later, so second service, I get up. Here's what I say in second service. I say, "Alexa, donate $500 to Memorial Road Church of Christ." That didn't work. I was trying. Well, Eric Trigestad, he's the editor for the Christian Chronicle, and he goes to Memorial Road. Well, it's a funny story, so he posted it on the Christian Chronicle website, and 2 days later, my phone just blows up. Tons of text messages from a lot of people I haven't heard of from years. NPR picked up the story, and for 30 seconds, ran the story of Alexa across the country, even mentioning my name. So of all the things to become like your 15 minutes of fame, of all the mission trips I've led and all the sermons I've preached and all the kids I've baptized, toilet paper. That is what that is what eventually made it big time. But I tell you that story just it's crazy. Like the world we live in is so different, culturally speaking, technologically speaking. You can back up. I'll get to that slide in just a minute. You can go back to the beginning. I'll tell you another story. Just this one, not as lighthearted, to illustrate how the culture we live in and how difficult it is to know what to do to raise children today. So about 2 months ago, I preached a sermon, get done, invitation song, young person comes forward, 12 years old, on the front pew. This young person and the parents start explaining the story. Young person is biologically female, wants to be called a male, wants a boy's name. Parents don't really know what to do. Come to find out later that the parents had allowed this person to have unfiltered internet access from age 7 to 10, and this person had developed a male persona online and then now was wanting to just embody that. And so I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what do I say to the church at this point? How do we handle this? What pronoun do I use? And it was difficult to even know what to do in the moment, because I know there's families out there watching. What are you going to do, and how am I going to explain this to our kid? And I know that's a rabbit hole, and I'm not going there right now. What we ended up doing was we used the pronouns they wanted. The family wanted counseling, so we got the family into counseling, and we baptized the young person that day. But it's hard, super hard to know how to raise young people in this kind of environment. So going back to NPR, they reported this: the number of kids who struggle with thoughts of suicide or who attempt to kill themselves is rising. New research finds that children ages 5 to 17 visited Children's Hospital for suicidal thoughts or attempts about twice as often in 2015 as even in 2008. It's a pretty startling statistic there. It's very recent. And so young people, they're super stressed out, depression rates are rising, and then as parents, we're trying to figure out, okay, how do you navigate this? And I'm right in the mix with you. We're just about to hit the teenage years. My kids are 8 and 10, and then I spent 7 years of my ministry career with teenagers. That's what I did. It's hard, super hard to know what to do. I'll give you one more example, and then I want to get to a few. I basically just have 3 ideas that I'm going to share with you in this first session. But one more example of just the complex culture we live in. This comes from my small group just 2 weeks ago. The guy leading the discussion was talking about the kinds of things that as adults we watch and listen to. And he was leading the discussion, and at one point someone asked the question to the group, how many of you heard your parents tell stories about walking out of movies because something was said or something was shown that just bothered them, so they got up and walked out? And pretty much every person in the group raised their hand and said, yeah, my parents, they told me stories of walking out of movies. Well, then the question was asked, well, what about you? How many of you, and these are a bunch of people in their 30s, how many of you ever walked out of a movie because of something that bothered your conscience? Not a hand went up. And I'm not sure if it had ever struck me that, so my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, not that they were perfect, but they had this cultural conscience, this moral, ethical code, and they lived by it pretty strongly, collectively speaking. And then even people my age in their 30s now are like, yeah, we're not going to walk out. And even people in my group had said, yeah, we're going to tolerate a lot more than our parents' generation did. And I was saddened by that, because it dawned on me that my generation's got things to work on, and then we're the ones that are trying to raise the next generation of children and teenagers. So I want to give you 3 thoughts this morning about how we might engage culture. The first one that comes from the book of Daniel, and I'm sure if you've been to seminars or if you've been in church very long, anytime you're thinking about how to engage culture, Daniel is the book. It's the best book to talk about. There's so many helpful principles in the book of Daniel. So I'm going to speed through just a quick overview of how Daniel and his friends engaged Babylonian culture. So a few things just to keep in mind. First of all, Babylon's pretty immoral back in the Old Testament. Child sacrifice is rampant. Pagan worship is everywhere. It's very sexually promiscuous culture. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get deported to Babylon, and they're faced with the very difficult task of how do we follow Yahweh, live in Babylon. Well, it's interesting because in chapter 1, we learned that on multiple fronts, they're actually very engaged in Babylonian culture. So first of all, they get new names, and they don't really push back on that. Second of all, we learned in chapter 1 that they get a Babylonian education, so they start going to the schools of Babylon. And we don't necessarily know this from Scripture, but we know this from history that the kinds of things they would have learned in Babylonian school would have been things like divination, things like how do we read the stars to tell fortune and tell the future. They would look at the liver of goats and sheep and try to discern from the liver how you could, again, tell the future. In fact, if you just read through the book of Daniel, a lot of the people talked about are sorcerers and astrologers. So when Daniel and his friends went to Babylonian school, those would be the kinds of things that they would learn. And it's interesting because Scripture doesn't say that they got angry about that or pushed back against that or rioted, boycotted that. They went to the schools. The third thing we learn in the first few chapters is that they got jobs in the Babylonian government, that they became employees of Babylonian bureaucracy. And so what we know, again, from outside sources is here's what people in the government did in Babylon. They would collect taxes. They would make advancements for the Babylonian army. They would make judicial decisions for the Babylonian people. So all that to say, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego did not bury their heads in the sand. They fully engaged, at least culturally speaking, with what was going on in Babylon at that time. Now, if you just stopped there, it'd be easy to say, well, we should just fully engage our culture today. Well, that's not all they did in the first few chapters. So if you go back to the story, again, you'll probably remember a lot of these things. But in chapter 1, we read this verse about the dietary laws. So here's what Daniel did. Verse 8 of chapter 1. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. So he made this very strict boundary in his own life. And from what we think, eating the king's food was a way of accepting the king's lordship, and he didn't want to do that. And so he drew this very firm boundary line in the sand and said, you know what, I'm not crossing that. Not going to do that. Later in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar raises up this big statue, and then we have this great scene where we find these 3 people, and yes, they have Babylonian robes on, and yes, they speak the Babylonian language of Akkadian. Yes, they have Babylonian names, they have a Babylonian education, Babylonian jobs, but they don't bow down to this Babylonian statue. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they don't bow down. 3:17, we will not serve your gods. We will not worship the image of gold you have set up. So same idea here. They drew this line. This is a very clear line. We're not going to cross that line. Chapter 6, king orders Daniel not to pray. Daniel does not follow the order. Daniel, in chapter 6, verse 10, 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed. So he's still praying 3 times a day. So once again, he's drawing a line, very clear line. He's not going to cross that. I'm not going to bow down. I'm not going to pray. Or I'm not going to pray to you, King Nebuchadnezzar. So here's the point. And first takeaway I'd offer you this morning is this. Your spiritual commitment needs to come before your cultural engagement. So both of them are extremely important, but I think there's an order there. So sometimes I find young people will often ask the question to their youth ministers or to their parents. They'll say something like, hey, Mom, Dad, so-and-so's having a party on such and such date, and I really want to go because these people need to know about Jesus. And I want to witness for my faith, and I want to share my faith with these people. Can I go? Well, I have a very clear answer to that, and you might disagree with my answer, but you're welcome to say this when your teens ask you this question. My answer is this. I want you to follow the Jesus model here. The Jesus model is, did Jesus go engage in the party scene? Absolutely. But who were Jesus' closest friends? Disciples. His closest circle were the people that encouraged him. They were the people that became his source of energy, his source of spiritual strength. Those were the guys that he spent day in, day out, all this time with those people. And I think that gave even Jesus himself this immense reservoir of spiritual strength so that when he would go out into the party scene, there was no temptation there because he was already really strong. And so when the teen's asking me that question, my question back is to say, are your closest friends good, solid Christian guys and girls that don't really get caught up with the bad stuff? Well, if the answer to that is yes, then my response is absolutely. You go to that party, take one of those people with you, because that's a dark place and those people need light. But if the answer is no, to be honest, my best friends are the people that don't do great things, then I would say absolutely you do not go to that party because you're going to get eaten alive. There is no way that you'll stand strong in that kind of environment if you don't have the close people, the spiritual strength of these friendships. This is the story of Daniel. He's first spiritually committed. That comes first. And only after that can he be culturally engaged. Give you a great illustration from somebody that many of you in the room are going to know really well. So this community and my community now share a connection with Kevin Hervey. Kevin Hervey played at University of Arlington right around here. He's with the Thunder right now. And he's been coming to my church for about 2 years, and we've developed quite a friendship. And he's been in my office several times telling me about what it's like to be a professional athlete. And one of the first things he told me was really interesting. He said, Phil, it's amazing how immoral the NBA is behind the scenes. You've basically got a bunch of super wealthy young people that don't have a lot of wisdom, and they can do anything they want. They can get any girl they want. They can go to any party they want, and they have a lot. There's a lot of big heads. And so he said, it was really interesting what he said to me one day. He said, Phil, I want to do a bunch of church stuff. Okay, what do you mean? He's like, just put me to work. I want to volunteer with the youth group. Let me lead communion prayers. I need to come up here. I want to have Bible studies with people. I want to study the Bible with you. I want to do a lot of church stuff. I said, okay, well, why do you want to do that? And he said, well, Phil, the culture is that immoral. It's really immoral. And the only chance I have of staying spiritually strong is if I make sure that my spiritual life is really, really strong. And if I pay attention to that part of my life, that's my only chance of surviving in this really immoral world. Wasn't that a great response? I mean, you got a guy that can do a lot, and he's trying to make it big time right now, but he's keeping his faith as super, super important. It's a great testimony. And I know several of you will know him, and he's got amazing parents, and your spiritual commitment has got to come before your cultural engagement. And I would point out one more irony here before I move on to another thought. And this is just based on my observation. I have found that people who are very spiritually committed are precisely the people that aren't engaging culture. And I'm just talking about my church at home. The people that are following Jesus and coming to church all the time and reading their Bible all the time and praying all the time, that group of people tends to spend all their time with other Christians. And I want to say to that group of people, you're exactly the people we need out in the world, engaging the world, because you are so spiritually strong. So yes, go to church a little bit, then go, get out, go build relationships with people that don't know Jesus. And then the opposite is true as well, that the people that are so wanting to make a difference in culture, I got to go to this place and that place, they're not the ones that are spiritually committed and spiritually strong. So the point being, your spiritual commitment, it's got to come first. And once that's there, we need people that will go engage culture. So second idea, so right now, we're actually dealing with this in my family on a fairly small way. My 10-year-old loves to read, and she's in this trilogy of books, and my wife was previewing one of the books, and just a few days ago she said, Phil, this third book in the series does not paint women in a positive light. It really pigeonholes them. And it also is pretty down on just religion in general. So it's a good book, but it's not great about women, and it makes religious people seem just like idiots. Do we let Anna read this? So we talked about that for a while. Do we let her? Do we not? And that's a very low-level example of something that we're all dealing with on much greater levels. As we raise our young people, how much do we let them experience what's going on in the world versus protect them from that? It's a really, really difficult question. So there's a resource that just came out that I find very helpful on this particular front. Barna Institute with David Kinnaman has put out a lot of books over the years, but this last one they've put out is really, really helpful. It's called Faith for Exiles. In Faith for Exiles, what this book did is they went out and found the people in their 20s and 30s that were extremely faithful to Jesus. And they surveyed those people. What happened in your upbringing that caused you to be so committed to Jesus? And so the whole book is just five principles of the most committed young people. Well, the second principle I think is really, really important. The second principle on the list is the ability to practice cultural discernment. And so this is what I would suggest to you as the second takeaway from this morning is cultural discernment is a skill that can be learned. So here's one of the questions that was asked in this book, survey questions that I found pretty interesting. So the question was, I regularly experience teaching in my church on wisdom for how to live faithfully in a secular world. And there's several categories here. You can put this next chart on the screen if it's there. So I regularly experience teaching in my church on wisdom for how to live faithfully in a secular world. And so for ex-Christians, people that used to be Christians, 14%. For the unchurched, it was 20%. For people that do go to church but don't consider themselves very committed, it was 44%. But this fourth group, and this is the group that as Christians we all want our kids and teenagers and college students to be in, for the resilient disciples, the ones that are most committed, 70% of them said that they regularly got that teaching of how do I apply wisdom to my experience with a secular world. And so what this means is that in age-appropriate ways, I think it's extremely important how to teach kids to evaluate what they see and what they hear. Because the truth is, as parents, it's impossible to protect them from everything. And so if we play that game, just let's build a really strong bubble, the bubble's going to break. It's always going to break. And so the better teaching strategy, in my opinion, is instead of trying to protect kids from everything, it's how do we teach kids to be discerning in themselves so that as these things keep coming at them, they can have the tools already built into their thinking so they know how to handle it at their age. So here's a couple practical ways to do this. I think the easiest place to start, especially with small children, and we're right around this age with my own kids, it's to use TV commercials as opportunities to practice cultural discernment. So for the last several years, we watch commercials, and I ask the girls, I say, okay, what are they trying to sell? And they just try to figure it out. It's that very simple question. We're starting to get to a shift where I've added a second question, and the second question is, what need is this company trying to make me feel like I have? Oh, well, they're trying to make me feel like I'm lonely to sell that product, or they're trying to make me feel like I'm ugly to sell that product. So it's just teaching the girls not everything they see is neutral. In fact, none of what they see is neutral. There's usually an agenda behind it, and I'm trying to train their brains to discern, okay, what's going on? So here's another method that for older kids, and this is again from the book Faith for Exiles, but these are, next slide, this is fantastic, it's super practical. 4 questions that you can start asking yourself as you watch things and listen to things, and as you teach your kids. Here's again 4 questions as we learn to engage culture. Question 1, what is right? Question 2, what is wrong with this? Question 3, what is missing? And then question 4, what is confusing? Really helpful set of questions. So just to apply this, let's say you're watching the iconic TV show Friends, and so you ask the question, okay, what's right about this show? Well, these people are really loyal to each other, and that's a biblical virtue. This is really good. It's a good lesson on loyalty. Well, what's wrong about the show? Well, sex is portrayed as just something that we just do whenever we want. It's very casual. Just do it all the time, whenever you want, with whomever you want. That's probably not well, that's definitely not the way the Bible would teach sexual ethics. What's missing from that show? There's really no hint of faith in the show. That people aren't ascribing to any kind of a relationship with God. What is confusing about the show? The thing I find most confusing about the show is how these people hold down jobs when they spend all their time in the coffee shop. But so you can make it kind of playful too, but these are really helpful questions. Ask them about any show that you watch, any show your kids watch, they're really helpful. And so over time, the goal here is you want your kids, and I would say we want ourselves, to develop the kind of thinking where we can discern the messages that culture is sending us. So if you were to apply this to TV shows over time, here's a few of the messages that you might receive. This is a big list here. So these are messages that do come from the shows we watch. Number one, sex is for personal fulfillment and self-denial is unhealthy. Any kind of sexual expression is fine as long as it's consensual. Follow your heart. Something is true if it feels true. If you follow your dreams, you'll be happy. Marriage is for much later in life, after you've fully developed as a person. Family members make fun of one another. That's a really interesting one. Just think about how much you see that on the kind of stuff you watch. Workplaces are full of incompetent and dysfunctional people. Clergy members are old, irrelevant, and only good for marrying and burying. So that you'll start picking up on these things, but again, until we say them out loud, they're not really having an effect one way or the other. So with teenagers and with kids, what I find is really helpful is, you watch a show and maybe you pause it in the middle and say, well, how did that portray that minister? How was he portrayed? Or what message does this send us about sex? And then to follow up with the question, well, what do we know from Scripture? Because if we're not actively teaching kids as they watch these shows, then the shows become the teacher. So we have to, it takes a lot of work to do this, but you have to insert yourself into the middle of it, or else they're not going to have any way to discern what's really happening here. So again, the idea is teach your kids to be culturally discerning, and it's a skill. It's a skill that can be learned at any stage. Here's another example. So if you apply this cultural discernment idea to the use of cell phones, here's another list of messages that we get from what our cell phones are doing to us. And this is very brief. I do think it's important that we talk about technology, and I'm going to have a few more things to say later in the day. But this is a good list of messages that our cell phones teach. They push the tyranny of the now. They frame and filter reality. This one, and this is from the Faith for Exiles, but this sentence is really, I've been thinking about this third one a lot. We weaponize humor by making snark cool. Isn't that powerful? And again, if you talk to youth ministers, talk to parents of teens with cell phones, this is just normal. You use your cell phone as a weapon to attack someone else with sarcasm. It's so normal, but it's not necessarily biblical. They overload our choices. They fill our time, distract our minds. They make people even more image conscious. We could talk forever about that one. They give people a sense of interacting and participating, but we know that's not necessarily true. Here's one more great quote from Kinnaman, and then I'm going to move on to the third big idea. So Kinnaman says this is really helpful. We're not anti-tech, we're anti-foolishness. We can ratchet anxiety down and ratchet resilience up by cultivating wisdom. It's a really, really helpful thought. Cultivate wisdom, that's the idea. So first big idea is spiritual commitment has got to come before cultural engagement. Second big idea is that cultural discernment, it's a skill. And you can learn it, your kids can learn it if you just practice it. So third big idea, this is the largest biosphere ever constructed. And it's in Arizona, $150 million research project. They built all sorts of ecosystems throughout the earth. You got rainforests, rivers, deserts, plants, animals. So they spent years developing this, and then in the first few weeks, they noticed all these things were going wrong. A bunch of the plants were wilting, the animals were dying, couldn't figure out why, because this was supposed to simulate pristine environment. Scientists did all this research, or this study to figure out what was wrong. Super interesting what they found out. The one thing that was wrong with it was that there was no wind. And because there was no wind, it made the trees really weak. And when the trees were weak, their root systems went dry, and that affected the plants, and the plants affected the animals, and everything started to decline because of lack of wind. You got to have wind. So here's the third practical takeaway about how to engage culture. Resistance is vital. So this is a play on words from the old Star Trek line, resistance is futile. I would argue the opposite. Resistance is vital. Meaning, if Christians aren't actively aware of what is good and what is evil, and if we're not actively aware of who we're fighting for and who we're fighting against, we become really weak. We become like those trees. We have to be resisting something. Scripture says resist evil or resist the devil, he'll flee from you. We're now in an era where, at least from my perspective, there's just not a lot of resistance going on. It's a who really cares kind of a culture. We have to identify what evil is in our world and then actively resist it. So Richard Beck wrote a book called Reviving Old Scratch. It's a book about spiritual warfare. And one of the stats he quotes is 40% of Christians don't believe in the embodiment of evil in the personified being of Satan. So 40% of Christians don't believe in Satan. Well, that's a challenge there, because if there's no such thing as Satan, if there's no such thing as evil, then what are we fighting against? I want to tell you one final story and then wrap up here. So in the World War II, the Nazis were at the height of their power, and there was this group called the White Rose Resistance Group. And this is a monument to their group in Germany. It's a really interesting group because they fought back against Hitler through really simple things like writing graffiti on walls and putting out flyers. And some of the flyers were pretty hardcore. So, for example, hit the next slide. Do I have the quote of the, yeah. Every word that proceeds, this is on one of the flyers that was put out. Every word that proceeds from Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war. His mouth is the stinking maw of hell, and his might is fundamentally reprobate. I will ask you, those of you who claim to be Christians, did not God himself give you the strength and the courage to fight against these powers? We must attack the evil one where it is strongest, and it is strongest in the power of Hitler. So this is very strong language aimed in the direction of the most powerful man in the world at the time, Hitler. Well, the Nazis found out about these flyers and launched this investigation, traced the source back to this small college in Munich. Got to Munich, did some investigating there, found out that these flyers went back to these two siblings, Hans and Sophie Skoll, 19 years old. It was all their idea. They arrested them, had a trial, which wasn't really a trial. They convicted them of treason, and they sentenced them to execution to take place the very same day. So Hans and Sophie Skoll were put to death at the age of 19. Eyewitnesses say that when the guillotine came down on Hans, last three words he said were, "Long live freedom." So they both died. A guy by the name of William Stringfellow was really bothered by this story because he wrestled with, why would they do that? Meaning, why would you put out flyers when you know that's not going to stop Hitler? Like, the potential rewards of putting out flyers is very low, but the risk is very high. You could lose your life. And so he was bothered by this. Why would anybody do that? So after the war ended, Stringfellow went to Germany, and he started interviewing all these survivors of the war, and specifically survivors who had taken part in these kinds of activities, asking them the question, why did you do this? Why did you hide these few Jews? Why did you put out these flyers? Why did you disobey the Nazi orders? Because he was trying to figure out who would do this. It was super interesting the main response he got back from all these interviews was this: resistance became the only human way to live. And so these people understood that their one little act, it's not going to win the war, but it was actually going to keep them alive. And so Beck, when he's reflecting on this later, he says to not resist was to die, to undergo a spiritual death, to surrender to the darkness. And so I think the point here is that we're living in a culture where a lot of Christians have given up on resisting evil. We're just like, yeah, we don't know if it exists. We're just going to float by. But if we don't identify what is evil in our own world and teach our kids to identify this is evil, this is not from God, then what happens is we get really weak. And so I would just really encourage you as parents, as ministers, as people who care about this next generation of people, don't be afraid to define what evil is. And use Scripture as your guide. Because when you and I can define, yes, this is what evil is, and we can resist it, well, that's the very thing that's going to keep us spiritually alive and close to God. I'll tell you one final story about a family. I think it's a really cool, hopeful story. I have a family at Memorial Road, and from day one, the dad, whose name is David, when his kids were getting into middle school, they were both his boys were super good athletes. And so he was like, okay, how am I going to navigate this youth sports culture, this new religion, sports culture? What am I going to do? And he and his wife decided day one, church is going to come first, all the time. So his boys missed certain games, coaches got angry, players got angry, boys hated it. But that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do. So they kept by that practice. It was super hard at first, then the boys got used to it. They grew up. One of the kids was one of the best wide receivers in 5A football in the state of Oklahoma last year. The other kid was a great track runner, ran at Oklahoma Christian, and he's training for the Olympics for Tokyo. And so his dad kept this really strong principle, you know what, church is going to come first. And it didn't hinder the boys in their sports. And so I love that story because, again, back to Daniel, he picked a line, we're not going to cross it, and everything turned out okay. God still blessed them. So I told that story in a sermon the other day. One of our deacons asked me to coffee that week, and he was like, Phil, I thought that was ridiculous. I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, my kids are athletes, and the thing is, Phil, if I don't make them go to all their practices, they might not make the team. And I was like, yeah, I know. And are you thinking about the big picture? Phil, they have to make the team. So then I said, who do you want your kids to be when they're 30? Well, I want them to go to church, love God, be good husbands, good wives. What does that have to do if your kid makes the football team at age 12? He wouldn't put it together. You got to play the long game. And your commitment to Jesus has got to come first. And usually what happens is God blesses that. Maybe not in the short term, but definitely in the long term. Your spiritual commitment's got to come before your cultural engagement. Cultural discernment is a skill set that you can learn and can practice. And then resistance. Resistance is vital. Let's pray. Father, thanks for every man and woman here today, and I pray for all of us as we seek wisdom. Father, I'm so thankful for all the other presenters at this conference, and I'm so excited to learn so many helpful things to engage our children and engage this culture. And so be with all of us. Help us to have a spirit of humility and a spirit of learning. And would you speak to us, Father? Would you help us to listen? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.